Welcome everyone. Today we are having an interesting conversation about queer people or people that belong to the LGBTQIA plus community accessing counselling support, and some of the things to consider when reaching out for counselling with a queer therapist, or you might be engaging with therapy with someone that is heterosexual, and maybe some of the things to consider before engaging with that or to be mindful of. My name is Stuart Cheverton. I'm a mental health social worker and one of the owners of Safe Place Therapy. And I'm here today with Sophie Manente, who is a counsellor with Safe Place as well. So welcome, Sophie.
Right, thank you. Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Now, before we get in, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I think there's a really nice segue there too, that when we are working with clients, that we really need to make sure about our our history and the kind of identities that we line up with, but also our ability to sit with different client presentations. And that's kind of the crux of what we're talking about today. So yeah, what is it like for you, Sophie, as a queer therapist, engaging with queer people coming to counselling?
Well, I really love it. I really love working with other queer people as a queer person myself. I think most of my clients are queer at any given time, which is really great. And yeah, it is such an interesting space to work in because our community is so diverse and so
Mhm.
broad, but also sometimes can feel small, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think that working with all the different kinds of queer folks that come through the door
Mhm.
um, as means that it always stays interesting, even though I'm a queer person myself and I
Mhm.
inhabit a lot of queer communities outside of work. Within work, I'm exposed to even more queer communities, which I find really exciting. And I think, yeah, and I think we'll get into it a little bit more as we go along. But
Yeah.
to being mindful of the identities that I hold,
Mhm.
and what that means for my clients in terms of what I will be able to relate to and know about their experiences, and what I won't know and what I won't be able to relate to, and where I might have to do more learning or
Yeah.
might have to just own what I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, really good point. And maybe just before we jump in even further is the word that we're using to kind of encompass the kind of umbrella term here is queer, that identifying as queer, but we are talking about people from the LGBTQIA plus community. That's a shorthand word. Some people might be totally okay with that. Some people might not be. And again, language, even in the first session, is really good to cover with a new client who we've never met before, and their comfort level of what actually resonates with them as a word that they identify with. Or they might not even be quite comfortable with a word yet. The LGBTQIA plus rainbow is so broad, but there's also a spectrum of that, and there's also different journeys where people might not have identified just yet as being queer or gay or what have you. Maybe they're literally just pondering it. Maybe they've never really pondered it or questioned it before, but now they want to come to therapy and actually talk that through.
Mm. Yeah, it's so true. It is a really good point. I think good to say that at the start as well, that language is so important and can be so empowering, but can also be so fraught.
Mm,
And so using queer as an umbrella term is just an easy shorthand,
yeah,
especially with, our acronym aiming to be inclusive, being a bit lengthy and mouthy to say. It's
yeah.
good to have a good shorthand, but also, yeah, acknowledging that not everyone likes having that as a shorthand or uses that term for themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So maybe it might be good to talk about a few examples of queer clients coming to see us, and maybe the some of the examples or the journeys that they've been on that they want to get some help for. And maybe then we can kind of dabble into some of the tricky scenarios where they might have engaged with counseling before, but actually engaged with a, heterosexual straight person, and that hasn't really gelled well, that hasn't really gone well. So one example that has come to my mind and has happened time and time again is a queer person goes to a straight counselor at like a high school or like a university, place. And there seems to be this real jump to encouraging people to come out. And when I've heard those stories from queer people, I actually am a little shocked by that because there's a really big assumption there that coming out is okay, that that person will be safe physically, from family or the culture that they're in, or the people around them, or even emotional safety, where there might actually be threats of being kicked out of the family home, or shunned from their culture or their religion, or their family, their friends not liking them anymore. That is actually still a reality now. So, and again, I'm not hinting here that all queer therapists gets it right all the time, but I think there's much more awareness in the community, in the queer therapist community, that we really have to be careful about, not actually really encouraging anything, actually just sitting and creating safety for that queer person. Um, have you had an experience like that, Soph, with a client sharing that story?
Yeah, yeah, definitely I have.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it's as society has become a little more inclusive to queer people, even though that's still very fraught these days,
Mm.
there can be, I think, yeah, a push to come out and just own it and just be proud of yourself and just do it, live your
Yep.
life, live your authentic life. But it is so complicated. Coming out is such a complicated process.
Mm.
And I think there's a lot to think through, a lot to think about beforehand. How is it going to impact all these different areas of life? And also being aware that it will, I think for most people, there will be impacts that you didn't guess when you first did it.
Mhm.
And so I think that, yeah, not being too pushy with
Mhm.
coming out, like whether it's other therapists or other people, is important. Supporting someone to just explore what it's going to be like for them
Mhm.
is so important. And that, yeah, definitely have had those experiences where someone have, especially with young people, I think there is
Mhm.
something there that we have a lot of, I think maybe we have a lot of concern for young queer people,
Mhm.
which makes sense. But yeah, I think there can be a bit of a push there to hurry up and let's come out so that we can include you and accommodate you.
Mhm.
Um, but the impacts on people's lives can be so far reaching, and even just on a very personal individual level, it can just be scary and very vulnerable time. And if people have other mental health issues going on or other big personal difficulties in their life happening at the same time,
Mhm.
that person feeling internally safe, as safe as possible, is
Mhm.
so important. And only they'll be able to determine when they are.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes to the crux of what we're talking about today is a straight therapist who might have a queer friend or a sibling that's queer, or has just been around queer people, doesn't necessarily mean they know all queer people's story and the risks involved in someone coming out, or even just knowing about internalized queerphobia or really big topics that affect queer people.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. And exactly all those really subtle ways that it comes across. Like I know that I've spoken to some straight cis therapists who think that internalized homophobia just means
Mm.
I hate the fact that I'm queer.
Yeah.
When it's so much more complicated than that. There can be so many
Mm.
more subtle ways that it presents. It can be, um, I mean, it can be someone just minimizing their queerness, kind of
Mm.
acknowledging, yes, I'm queer, but I'm not queer enough because of this and that and the other.
Mhm.
And yeah, so many other ways. And so there can be these nuances that a straight cis therapist might not quite be able to grasp.
Yeah. Yeah. And in a similar way, like I have worked with a few people that are First Nations, so they identify that way. In a first session, if I'm actually engaging with someone from a different culture, it's really important to name my whiteness, to name that, I am a cis male, I am queer. So there are things that I won't fully understand. I'll try my best to understand, but there might be specific things that I don't actually feel that I have the skills or ability to, talking about maybe intergenerational trauma from a First Nations perspective is a really specific, traumatizing, complex issue that I actually don't feel comfortable. So if the person wants to work on that, maybe I'm not the right fit. And that needs to be kind of front and center as a therapist for any client that we engage with, that we need to consider the client safety, but also the kind of clinical issues that might arise, that if you delve into that and the person is disclosing or sharing stuff that you get really overwhelmed with really quickly, it can get very messy, very easily.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, it is so true. Because at the end of the day, it is a relationship between the therapist and the client. Like we do, yes, we are professional selves
Mm,
in the room with clients, but we are also ourselves. We are still bringing who we are and what our background is, what our knowledge, our biases, all those things. We're bringing that into the room, and so yeah, I think owning what we know and what we don't know.
mhm,
Um, is especially important. And just because, like we're saying, yes, we're queer therapists, so maybe we can understand some queer experiences more, there's still some that we won't. Like whether, like, really good point you made of a First Nations client or someone who has a cultural background that I'm not a part of.
mhm,
Um, I think that owning that is so important. I'm remembering
mhm,
a client who was talking to me about coming out and navigating that whole landscape. And
mhm,
there was such a concern about the impact it would have on their relationships with their family,
mhm,
with their immediate family, but also their broader community that their family were a part of. Um, and I found myself, learning things about that community and about that culture from this client that I didn't know.
mhm,
And so I was open with the client that I wasn't aware of these kinds of um, views and norms and things like that that existed in that culture, and that I was kind of learning from that.
mhm,
Um, but understanding also that uh, as a queer person who also comes from a background of some conservatism in my family and cultures that I'm a part of, I
mhm,
do get that.
mhm,
But even then, within each family, within each culture, there's
mhm.
its own version.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's really about taking the time to understand the different family members, that queer person has, their relationship that they have with them, but also what they want long term. So, I've definitely even friends of mine who have chosen not to come out to their grandparents, not decided not to have a wedding because with their committed partner, simply for the simple fact that they don't want to change that relationship in their end parts of their grandparents' life, and that's been their personal choice. And there's no right or wrong in that. It's a personal choice that that person is making carefully. Um, and they need people in their corner that aren't pushing an agenda or pushing a certain coming out, timeline.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah. I think I've had clients as well who have chosen to postpone coming out or limited their coming out for
Yeah.
the sake of older family members who, I mean, one client, it was literally that this grandparent was really elderly and not able to handle stress very well. And so it was could potentially be a threat to her health, as
Yeah.
well as their relationship in in this grandparent's last years.
Mhm.
And those relationships are really important. I mean, family
Mhm.
is really important, community is really important. And I think there can be a culture, particularly within white, Western, Anglo-Saxon styles of therapy. This is something I've witnessed, but also that I've heard a lot of people of color talk to me about,
Yeah.
clients of color talk to me about, where they've experienced white therapists really pushing them to come out and then just cut contact with their family. Because if your family doesn't accept who you are, then they're bad for you and they shouldn't be in your life. And I
Hmm.
mean, that can be so dangerous
Mm,
to encourage people to do because, I mean, we we are social creatures. We need relationships just as much as we need to live our authentic selves. And
mm,
so finding that middle ground of how do you claim this part of yourself, but
mm,
also maintain the support systems and relationships that are really important to you
mhm.
is a delicate balance that we need to be careful of as individuals and as therapists supporting people on that journey.
Yeah, yeah. Also, that expression of that identity too, I think a lot of people, a lot of queer clients might freak out about is, when we say come out, when we say be a queer person, that doesn't mean you have to jump on a gay pride float and, wave your particular flag around, right? Like it doesn't have to be, I've got my rainbow pin, I'm part of the club now. It can be whatever you want it to be and whatever expression that is.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's so true. There can be such pressure to, yeah, just
Hmm.
become the big rainbow gay or something
Mm,
like that. And I've
mm,
actually had clients say to me that it took them a while to, part of why it took them a while to even realize they were queer was that they couldn't relate to that kind of
mm.
presentation or version of being queer, that maybe they like to wear pretty plain clothes and don't love to go to a parade, you know.
Yeah.
And so yeah, understanding that there's as many queers as there are humans
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
um, is so important as well. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I think that those words of, taking for instance, being a queer guy or a gay male, there's a term out there that is men who have sex with men. So to kind of help some clients explore something that might be very, very dangerous or too scary to identify as being queer or bi or gay. There's actually this kind of language out there in the community that maybe not many people realize is you can have sex with a guy and be a guy and not be gay, right? Or not identify as being bisexual. Like it's actually okay to explore these different things and, maintain a certain kind of sexual identity. That's okay.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is okay.
Hmm.
And still, yeah, such a valid human experience and
Mm,
doesn't nullify your even if you do identify as straight or something like
mm.
that, doesn't nullify what your identity is.
Yeah.
And I think that the fact that we are becoming more fluid with
Hmm.
language
Hmm.
and making more space for all those different experiences means that people are going to feel seen more and
Hmm.
people are going to feel safer to be open about their experiences, to have the experiences that they want to have, and
Hmm.
then maybe even talk to their therapist about it and get some support for it.
Hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I kind of threw out a little segue there around connecting with other people in a sexual way. Um, Again, drawing back to a counselor that you may see, it should feel really comfortable that you can talk about sex, right? So if you are doing that kind of coming out experience or exploring your sexual identity, sex should be okay in a therapy setting, and therefore we should think about the person we're going to see and their vibe and their kind of presence in the room with us. But also, it's actually okay to throw that out in a first session to gauge the therapist's the ability to go there, but also comfort level as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. I totally agree. I think that talking about sex should be okay in
Mm,
the therapy space. And I think that's something that we talk about a lot here at Safe Place,
mhm,
trying to be a clinic full of practitioners who are really comfortable talking about sex,
mhm,
because it's such an important part of a lot of people's lives. There's, even people on the asexual spectrum who maybe sex isn't a part of their life, or maybe it is in some way. It's still something that they have to navigate.
mm,
In any case, it's so likely that sex is going to come into your life at some point in some way, and
mm.
being able to talk about that is important because it's a vulnerable space as
Yeah.
well. And that's another thing that might be easier if you're a queer person. If you go and see a queer therapist, it might just be easier to talk about queer sex with another queer person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And, again, I am a cis male who hasn't had sex with a woman. So I'm not saying that I, know all the intimate details about, sex with a woman, but I'm very okay to sit in that space with someone. So really kind of again owning identity, owning comfort level, but also kind of, naming the gap that might be there for some people.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. And something that, a great straight therapist could definitely navigate well, even if they're
Mm,
not as familiar with what happens in different forms of queer sex.
mm,
But yeah, I think that, yeah, owning that
mm,
is important, but also I'm just remembering a client that was talking to me about sex and talking about things like topping and bottoming and how a straight therapist might not know what that is,
mm.
and it might be a bit of an awkward moment where they go, "Oh, sorry,
Yep,
I don't really know what you're talking about."
yep.
A great straight therapist could handle that really well, and it could be
Mhm,
totally fine.
mhm.
But the benefit of seeing a queer therapist is you kind of cancel out some of that
Yep,
awkwardness.
yep, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other examples where it's felt really comfortable for you being a queer therapist, seeing a queer client, like any other
Hmm.
topics or things that just feels easy?
Thinking about a client. Or I think this probably happened with more than one client who are on the kind of coming out journey, not even the coming out journey, but just figuring out
Mm,
what their sexuality or gender identity might be.
mhm,
Um, and how there can be, I think for a lot of people, some self doubt that comes in.
mhm,
Does this really mean that I'm queer? Does this just mean that whatever?
mm,
And I think that um, something that can be useful for me as a queer person in the room with another queer person is that usually we can see queerness in other people. As queer people, we can recognize queerness in others in a kind of just
mm,
almost implicit way. You can just kind of feel it in someone, you
mm,
know.
mm,
And I've drawn on that with clients.
mm.
I've told them that you feel like a queer person to me.
Yep.
If they're, especially if I'm feeling like they really do feel like they want to own that for themselves, but are just struggling with internalized homophobia, queerphobia,
Mm,
just self doubt, insecurity, things like that. If
yep.
I'm sensing that's where they're at, that can that can be really helpful. Being seen as queer can be a really
Mm,
wonderful, empowering, validating experience for people. Of
mhm,
course, it can also be really scary in other settings, but in that particular therapy setting where you can see they're really wanting to own it, but just,
mm.
feeling insecure, having some self doubt, being like, I'm a queer person and I see queerness in you,
Yeah.
can be a really wonderful exchange to be a part of.
Hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I think sometimes too we get lost in this idea that coming out or, sexual identity exploration or gender exploration is all just for young people, right? But we've definitely
Mm,
had,
yeah.
some older people, 40, 50, 60 plus, who they might be in a really transitional part of their life where their relationship is broken down or something's kind of happened and it's kind of pushed them into therapy. But it's interesting how that can also line up with, I've never had sex with a same-sex person before. I've never identified this, but it's kind of making more sense as I'm engaging with, I don't know, queer film, or I've met this new friend. It can actually be a coming out or a change of self over time at an older age.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, there's really no rules, isn't it? I feel like I've seen so many endless variations of that coming through the door, different ways that people are um, different ages and stages of life that people are exploring their sexuality or their gender, or
Yeah.
people who have existed as one type of queer for a really long time and then
Mm,
suddenly they're a whole other kind of queer.
mm-hmm.
Like I've worked with a lot of trans people who've been existing as gay for a long time, but
Yep.
as they own their transness and come into their gender identity, they're
Mm,
realizing that their sexual orientation is changing.
mm,
And so it's kind of like two areas of queerness that are changing at once.
yeah.
Also, that can happen at any age.
Yep.
Um, and I think that's always I think that kind of coming into queerness whatever form it's taking in is always a really exciting space to work in.
Yeah, and I think there too that, I think the progress, I guess, in terms of mental health awareness, and the idea of internalized queer phobia has kind of come a long way, I think, but also kind of intersectionality around my brain is wired differently and I identify as being trans or queer, and how they both kind of meet. Have you had many examples of that?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
I think that I couldn't guess on numbers, but a lot of my queer clients also have an experience of neurodiversity, especially autism and ADHD. There's a lot of overlap between those lived experiences, which
Mhm.
is really interesting. And,
Mm.
I think a space that we're still understanding in the mental health world. There seems to be something there around
Yeah.
tendency towards challenging norms.
Mm.
That seems to be some kind of overlap there, but that's we're still figuring that out in the research. But yeah, um, another another good example of how therapists need to be aware of the intersection between
Mhm.
those two experiences and um, how that's how being ADHD or autism might affect someone's experience of navigating relationships or coming out, like we've talked about, and the
Mhm.
other way around as well. How does the potential challenges of being queer factoring into
Mm.
things like I don't know, autistic burnout, for example.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. For sure. And in my experience, I've noticed a lot of queer people who might, for some reason, I don't think it's a choice factor here, but they might have identified very early in primary school or high school that they are queer of some description. But the kind of neurodiversity or the kind of developmental issues going on, mental health issues going on, is kind of pushed back in the back of their brain, and that might actually be like a survival mechanism. I need to get through. I need to come out. I need to do this big journey and connect with people in this new identity. And then later on, say age 20 plus, 30 plus, that's when the person maybe might be a little bit more settled or they've got a new job. That's maybe when the kind of ADHD or neurodiversity stuff bubbles up for them.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's so true. It's almost like sometimes we can only handle
Mm.
one big internal what's the word? Kind of internal conflict or internal discovering and
Yeah.
that can go on at once,
Yeah.
and figuring out you're queer is a huge thing to navigate already.
Mm.
And I think especially for the um, some of the folks who, for example, with autism, people who
Mhm.
might be classified as level one,
Yeah.
um, can get away with can get
Mm.
away with their neurodiversity for a long time and fly under the radar and push through for a long time. And then sometimes, yeah, it is a little bit later in life as you're often it seems to be kind of late 20s, early 30s. I think that's a lot of the ones that I see
Mm.
when adult responsibilities are really ramping up.
Yeah.
Maybe there's kids, maybe there's career progression to the point where there's a lot of responsibility. That's when things start to things start to become difficult from the neurodiversity perspective.
Mhm.
And I mean, especially for that generation, people who are in their late 20s, early 30s now,
Mm.
are a little more likely to have been around when it was a little more acceptable to come out as queer, so a little
Mm.
more likely to have already
Mhm.
come to understand some queerness.
Yep.
Not always, though, definitely not always.
Yep.
But yeah, that kind of figuring out I'm queer, then figuring out I'm neurodiverse trajectory is really common.
And yeah, I guess that's that other trap of people assuming that a queer person comes along to see them, that they are actually aware of all the lingo, or because they're queer they are connected with the queer community, and kind of just fit right in, I suppose. Sometimes people have maybe even intentionally not engaged with that because they're very scared or worried that it might open the floodgates of their queerness, or it might be just really scary for them. So that's another assumption that sometimes people don't know about. Might not know about sex, might not know about sexual health, might not know about, different words, or they might have picked a word like asexual, for instance, but they've got to that because they haven't really found a better word that matches what they're going through, or their kind of romantic connection with other people.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true, isn't it?
Mhm.
That yeah, I think I agree that there can be this assumption that if you're queer, you know all things queer, and you're happy to be a spokesperson for all things queer,
Yeah.
um, which is so not the case. Again, we're
Yeah.
needing to own our experiences, but also the level of engagement with queer community is
Hmm.
so variable,
Hmm.
and sometimes that's a tricky thing for people. Sometimes they want more queer connection to queer community, but are struggling to make those connections. That's something where a great therapist can help. Or sometimes it's just not part of their queer journey to be
Yeah.
that connected,
Yep.
and that's okay as well.
Hmm. Hmm. And yeah, leading on from that, not knowing or knowing, right? Like I hear this very loud and clear from a lot of queer people, especially young people, is it's not our job as the queer community to educate other people, right? So if you're actually turning up in a counseling session, trying to build safety, trying to explore and talk about your vulnerabilities, it's actually not your job to educate or fill in the counselor. If they don't know, it's actually the counselor's job to know or to find out more, or to actually own, I don't know, and what does that mean for the therapy? What does that mean for what the client's going to get out of that experience?
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I think you're right that it is the therapist's job. If they don't know,
Mm,
we got to go learn. We got to go Google it or do some training or something
yeah,
like that rather than asking the client to explain it to us all the time.
yeah,
And that's definitely one of those, what I would call a therapist red flag. If you're a queer person seeing a straight cis therapist and you're finding you're always having to explain to them, oh, this is what, I don't know, topping or bottoming means. This is what
mm,
non-binary means.
mm,
And they're kind of always going to you.
mm,
That seems to be their go-to way of learning.
yep,
That's taking space away from you. That means that the exchange
yeah.
is now becoming about them and their needs.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So you're kind of you're carving out that time in the counseling room to educate them rather than, actually having someone in your corner who gets it and understands it. But even on a bigger level here, we need to consider that lots of trans and queer people who might be in a straight family, who are in a community that might be really conservative, they're constantly needing to educate and push or correct people around pronouns or say, hey, that's not okay. That's actually transphobic or that's actually queerphobic. To then actually bring that into the counseling room, it's simply not okay. It actually could be a real triggering thing for a queer person.
yeah, it's so true. That's such a
Mhm.
good point. Yeah, if you're a queer person, you're often having to do a lot of educating already.
Hmm.
And that can be a difficult, vulnerable space to sit in.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, not having that come into the therapy space is so important for
Mm,
creating safety for you in that space. I know that also another example to throw in there is having to do that at work. I think that's
mm,
a lot of queer people have to do that, have to be a kind of queer spokesperson at work. I know I've had experiences with that in the past.
yep.
It's so nice that I don't have to do that here at Safe Place
Mhm,
because there's so many of us that are queer and everyone else is so educated on queer issues that
mhm,
it's fine. But yeah, there can be so many different parts of life where we're having to do that or have to kind of take on that burden.
mhm.
Therapy shouldn't be one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's so many different bits and bobs to working with a queer person, and it takes a lot of kind of delicate work to sit with their experience, understand the lingo, and understand the kind of broader issues that the person might be going on, but really making sure that that client is in the driver's seat and kind of steering where they want to go with that work, whatever that looks like. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. I think that's so important with any good any
Mm,
good therapy, right, is always really driven by what the client wants, what
mm.
they need, and what they feel is the support that they need, rather than a therapist pushing, I think you should do this, I think you should do that.
I guess another thing too, as I've just been pondering, a queer person might have done the coming out thing, engaged with the family, been in a long-term committed relationship, and they actually just want to talk about other stuff. I think that can also be just a real comforting thing to go, right, you're queer, I'm queer, like let's get into other stuff that might not be related to their identity as well. And that ease of that with another queer person can actually feel a little bit different. I've heard from a lot of queer clients that it's almost like they have to, do some of those hoop jumping of, coming out and, talk about this. And, there's kind of a bit of a mechanical thing that maybe a lot of straight counselors might feel that they have to go through. But with a queer counselor, if the queer client is feeling really comfortable, has an agenda or has some work that is actually not about their identity at all, that's also okay.
Yeah, that's so true. That's a really good point. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because yeah, I think that maybe there can be this assumption that it's something you have to check if people are okay with
Hmm.
the fact that they're queer or they're trans.
Yeah.
When so often, yeah, that's not why queer people are going to therapy. They're going for all the other myriad issues of life that can happen.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I think I don't assume that it's an issue unless people bring
Mm.
it up.
Hmm.
It's something that I've heard, especially trans clients say, if therapists become aware that they're trans, or whether their clients disclosed,
Mm.
that the therapist will kind of ask, is that something you're comfortable and okay with in life? And the person say, yeah, that's fine. That's not what I'm here to talk about.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And that's also, I think, can be maybe an easier thing with a queer therapist, because like the example I gave earlier of client talking about topping and bottoming, it wasn't about I'm getting used to queer sex and getting used to topping and bottoming. It was just about the issue was sex in their relationship. That was it. We were talking about their relationship. Just
Mhm.
happened to use some queer terms there, but we weren't actually talking about queerness. We were
Yeah.
talking about sex in their relationship.
Yeah.
And that was just understood and fine.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, I think that's also, yeah, don't feel like when you go to therapy, don't feel like you have to talk about your queerness at all if that's not what you want to talk about.
Yeah. And I just had an idea out there, and I'm really curious to know the different people who watch this content, because you might actually be having a family member who isn't aware of lingo, and you actually want to kind of share this link or share this to start educating them or encourage them to reach out for counseling because they're struggling with your identity, right? Or you actually haven't come out to them yet, or you've literally just had that tricky conversation, but you're actually wanting that family member or friend or coworker or someone to engage with therapy to educate themselves. Like that's another area of counseling is if this is difficult, if queer identity is tricky or foreign or weird, it's actually really smart and maybe more mental health friendly for your loved one for you to do that work solo.
Mm, yeah, that's true. You mean for the other person in their
Yeah,
life to do that
yeah,
learning solo? Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that can be so much the supportive and loving thing to do, is to go and educate yourself, rather than again placing burden on someone who's probably already got some enough of that burden happening.
Yeah.
It's a real way that we can show love to a queer
Mm,
person in our life, is to go and learn,
hmm.
so that we can have those conversations with them and understand their experiences better, help
Hmm.
them feel seen.
Hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, whoever is kind of watching or listening to this content, we really hope that this has kind of hit something that's really important to you. Either a queer person who's never engaged with counseling because you are worried about what might happen. We've really pulled that issue apart and really encourage people to try to find a queer therapist. Or if you're someone that has been through a tricky relationship with a straight counsellor or any counsellor for that matter, it's really important. I really encourage you to find a right fit that feels supportive and safe. And you can definitely jump on our website, and we've got our website link in the comment section. But if you like this content, please please subscribe, sign up, share this with your friends, your loved ones, co-workers, whoever. And please remember that Safe Place Therapy is your safe place to talk, and reach out for help if you need to. So thanks, Soph, and we'll chat again soon, hey?
Yeah, no worries. Sounds good. That was fun.
Awesome.